It is the frozen heart of January in 1958. The highways of Nebraska stretch endlessly under a pale winter sky. The air sharp with cold, the silence broken only by the crunch of tires on snow. Into this landscape step two figures: a 19-year-old young man with a restless gaze and a 14-year-old girl whose quiet presence unsettles everyone who sees her. Together, they begin a journey that will leave the nation breathless with fear and fascination. At first glance, they look like any teenage couple. He idolizes James Dean, mimicking the rebel's stance and style. She listens, watches, and follows. But beneath the surface, something darker is stirring. When they set out across the icy roads, the world quickly realizes this is no ordinary escape. Families vanish, strangers disappear, and the pair move through towns with a chilling calm, as if nothing at all has happened. Newspapers splash their faces across front pages, branding them symbols of a youth gone astray. What makes this case so haunting is not only the trail they left behind, but the mystery of her silence. Was Caril Ann Fugate a frightened girl trapped in the shadow of Charles Starkweather, or was she a willing partner in his defiance of the world? Investigators struggled with the contradiction. She had moments when she could have fled, yet she stayed. And in one surprising twist, when police finally cornered them, Starkweather himself shouted, "Do not shoot her! She did not do anything!" That single line deepened the puzzle, leaving historians and true crime enthusiasts debating her role for decades. Imagine the tension of that final chase, snow whipping across the windshield, the car skidding on frozen asphalt, sirens echoing in the distance. When the vehicle spun out, she stepped out first, calm and deliberate, while he tried to run. Within minutes, the most wanted pair in America were in custody. 11 lives had been lost in just over a week. But the bigger question remained: who was truly in control? This story is not just about an incident in the past. It is about the unsettling truth that ordinary people can become part of extraordinary darkness. It is about how love, fear, and rebellion can intertwine until no one can tell where choice ends and coercion begins. And it is about how culture itself transforms such figures into legends, inspiring films like Badlands and Natural-Born Killers that continue to echo the fascination with violent young couples. If stories like this captivate you, stay with us, because exploring these cases is not just about the past, it is about understanding the fragile line between innocence and complicity, and perhaps about asking yourself, in the cold silence of those winter roads, what would you have done? Long before the night everything changed, Charles Starkweather was just another kid trying to survive his own life. Born in Nebraska during the 1930s, he grew up in a world that seemed designed to remind him he didn't belong. He was thin, awkward, with poor eyesight that forced him to squint constantly and slight deformities in his legs that made him walk differently. In the brutal social hierarchy of American high schools, these small differences were enough to make him a target. Day after day, the humiliation piled up. The popular kids laughed, the athletes pushed past him, teachers barely noticed him, and somewhere deep inside, a quiet rage began to grow. Charles didn't just feel rejected, he felt invisible. And for a teenage boy desperate to matter, invisibility felt worse than anything else. He started to hate, not in loud outbursts, but in a cold, calculating way. He hated the popular kids with their easy confidence. He hated wealthy men who seemed to own the world. He hated anyone with authority who made him feel small. But most of all, he hated the reflection staring back at him in the mirror. Then something shifted. Charles discovered James Dean. The rebel icon from the silver screen became his blueprint for transformation. He copied everything: the leather jacket, the slouched posture, the brooding stare, even the way Dean tilted his head when he spoke. He slicked back his red hair, practiced that dangerous look, and slowly began building a new identity. He wanted people to see him now. He wanted them to fear him. And then he met Caril Ann Fugate. She was only 14 years old when their paths crossed. A girl from an ordinary family, still figuring out who she was, suddenly captivated by this rebellious boy who seemed to live by his own rule. To her, Charles wasn't invisible at all. He was magnetic, intense, someone who made her feel like they were the only two people who truly understood how unfair the world could be. Their relationship became all-consuming, obsessive, a closed circle where Charles's dark worldview found an eager listener. He would tell her the world was cruel, that people were fake, that society crushed anyone who didn't fit the mold. And Caril? She listened. She stayed close. She believed him. No one around them understood how dangerous that combination had become. Two teenagers, bound together by resentment and a warped sense of us against them, drifting further from reality. Because in early 1958, Charles Starkweather made a decision that would change everything. He was done being humiliated, done being invisible, done playing by rules that had never protected him. And the first person to feel the consequences would be someone very, very close. The storm was coming, and no one saw it until it was far too late. It started over something so small it seemed almost meaningless. Charles had walked into a gas station on a cold December night in 1957, expecting to fuel up on credit. But Robert Culvert, the 21-year-old attendant working the overnight shift, said no. It was policy, no cash, no gas. For most people, this would have been a minor inconvenience, an embarrassment at worst. But for Charles Starkweather, it felt like another humiliation in a lifetime of being told he didn't matter. The rage simmered for days. Then, on December 1st, Charles returned to that same gas station. This time, he brought a shotgun. What happened next in that dimly lit building would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Robert Culvert died hours later from his injuries. Charles drove away into the winter darkness. And here's what's chilling. He felt no remorse, no shock at what he'd done. Instead, something else washed over him, a sense of power. He had spent his entire life feeling weak, invisible, controlled by everyone around him. But in that moment, he realized something terrifying. Taking a life was disturbingly easy, and it made him feel, for the first time, like he was in control. The police began investigating Culvert's case, but they had no suspects, no clear motive, just a young man gone too soon, and a community searching for answers. Meanwhile, Charles was making another decision, one that would prove even darker. He convinced himself that anyone who might interfere with him and Caril needed to be eliminated. And at the top of that list was her own family. On January 21st, 1958, Charles went to Caril's home on Belmont Avenue. Inside were her mother, Velda, her stepfather, Marion, and her 2-year-old half-sister, Betty Jean. By the time he left, all three were gone. What happened next is almost impossible to comprehend. The bodies remained hidden inside the small house for nearly a week. Charles and Caril placed a handwritten sign on the front door that read, "Stay away. Everybody is sick with the flu." The misspelled note kept curious neighbors at bay. Meanwhile, the teenage couple moved freely around town. They went to movies. They ate at diners. They acted as though nothing had changed, as though the world behind that door didn't exist. Neighbors noticed the strange silence. Some tried to visit but were turned away by the sign or by Caril herself, who appeared at the door claiming everyone was too ill for visitors. One detail that went unnoticed at the time. Charles had actually been staying inside the house with the bodies, waiting, planning, while maintaining this grotesque charade of normalcy. It was a level of cold calculation that defied belief. For days, life in that quiet Nebraska neighborhood continued as usual. People walked their dogs past the house. Kids played in the street. And no one knew that behind those walls, something unspeakable had already happened. But the illusion couldn't last forever, because soon the authorities would discover the truth. And by then, Charles and Caril would already be gone, racing across state lines, leaving a trail that would shock the entire nation. The case was no longer contained to one gas station or one house. It was about to become something much, much bigger. By the time police broke down the door on Belmont Avenue and discovered the horror inside, Charles and Caril were already gone. They had a head start, weapons, and nothing left to lose. What followed was 8 days that would paralyze the American heartland with fear. The couple tore across Nebraska and into Wyoming, stealing cars, taking hostages, and leaving a trail of tragedy that seemed to have no pattern, no reason, no end. First, they drove to a remote farm outside Lincoln where a wealthy businessman named August Meyer lived alone. Charles knew him vaguely from the past. They arrived unannounced, and by the time they left, Meyer and his housekeeper were both gone. The isolated farmhouse, surrounded by frozen fields and winter silence, became another crime scene. Then came Lauer and King, two teenagers barely older than Caril herself. Robert Jensen was 17. Caril King was 16. They were on a first date, driving along a country road, probably talking about school or music or plans for the future. They never made it home. Charles flagged them down, claiming he needed help. What happened next in that desolate area outside Bennett, Nebraska, would become one of the most haunting aspects of the entire case. Days later, a traveling salesman named Merle Collison was found in his Buick along a Wyoming highway. He'd been resting in his car when Charles decided he needed a different vehicle. Just like that, another life extinguished for convenience. The violence seemed completely random, unpredictable, without logic or mercy, and that's what terrified people most. Across the Midwest, families locked their doors. Parents kept children home from school. Gas station attendants eyed every young couple with suspicion. The case dominated every newspaper, every radio bulletin, every conversation. Photos of Charles and Caril appeared on front pages from coast to coast. America watched in real time as the manhunt intensified, as the body count rose, as the question everyone kept asking grew louder. How could two teenagers do this? But there was another question, one that divided the public and haunted investigators. What was Caril Ann Fugate's role in all of this? Charles claimed she was his willing partner, that she helped plan everything, that she was just as cold and calculated as he was. He said she laughed after some of the incidents, that she showed no emotion, no remorse. Caril told a completely different story. She insisted she was terrified the entire time, that Charles threatened to harm her family if she didn't obey, that she had no idea her mother and stepfather were already gone until much later. She painted herself as a hostage, trapped by fear and manipulation. The truth seemed impossible to pin down, because here's what confused everyone. There were multiple moments during those 8 days when Caril could have escaped. When Charles left her alone in a car while he went into a store, when they stopped at gas stations with other people around, when they passed police officers on the highway. She never ran. She never screamed for help. She never tried to slip a note to a stranger. Why? Was she brainwashed by a controlling older boyfriend? Was she genuinely afraid for her life? Or was there some part of her that wanted to be part of this rebellion against the world? Years later, a lesser-known detail emerged from witness testimonies. At one gas station stop, Caril had calmly walked inside and bought snacks while Charles waited in the car. The attendant remembered her seeming completely normal, even friendly, not like someone being held against her will. But trauma does strange things to people. Fear can make you cooperate with your captor. Psychologists would later explain how a 14-year-old girl could become trapped in a psychological prison even without physical chains. Still, the questions lingered. By late January, the net was closing. Law enforcement across multiple states coordinated efforts. Roadblocks went up, alerts went out. Every cop in the region carried photos of the Buick they were believed to be driving. And then, on January 29, 1958, outside the small town of Douglas, Wyoming, Charles made a mistake. He got into a struggle with a passing motorist who noticed something suspicious about the way the Buick was parked on the roadside. The confrontation escalated. Shots were fired. A deputy sheriff arrived, sirens wailing across the empty Wyoming landscape. Charles tried to speed away, but the chase didn't last long. The car spun out. He was captured within minutes, face down on the frozen ground, finally out of options. Caril was found in the car, shaking, crying, immediately telling officers she'd been held against her will the entire time. The 8-day nightmare was over, but the story, the questions, the debate about guilt and innocence and what really happened between two teenagers and the darkest version of themselves, that was just beginning. The end came on a frozen stretch of Wyoming highway where the wind cut like razors and the landscape stretched endlessly white. Charles and Caril had stolen yet another vehicle, a black Packard this time, and were racing west when a deputy named William Romer spotted something that didn't sit right. The car, the speed, the way it swerved slightly as it passed. He turned on his lights. What happened next unfolded in minutes, but felt like slow motion. Charles hit the accelerator. The Packard lurched forward, engine roaring as it carved through the snowy road. Romer called for backup and gave chase, his patrol car fishtailing on the ice as speeds climbed past 80, then 90 miles per hour. Other officers joined the pursuit. Radio chatter crackled across the region. This was it. The fugitives who had terrorized 2 states were finally cornered. The Packard skidded violently, tires shrieking against asphalt and ice. Charles wrestled with the wheel, desperately trying to keep control, but physics and panic won. The car spun out, sliding to a stop on the shoulder near Douglas, Wyoming. For a moment, everything went still. Then the doors flew open. According to witnesses, Caril emerged first, stumbling into the cold air, hands raised, face pale. She looked terrified, disoriented, like someone waking from a nightmare. Charles tried to run. He had a rifle. He shouted something incoherent. But within seconds, officers surrounded him, weapons drawn, voices sharp and commanding. "Get on the ground, now!" He complied. No dramatic shootout, no final standoff. Just a 19-year-old boy face down in the snow, finally out of road, out of options, out of time. The most wanted couple in America was in custody. News spread like wildfire. Radio stations interrupted programming. Newspapers printed special editions. Families who had been living in fear for over a week exhaled in collective relief. 11 people were gone. 2 teenagers were in handcuffs, and the entire nation was trying to process what had just happened. But the capture didn't bring closure. If anything, it opened a wound that would never fully heal. Because now the question everyone was asking became impossible to ignore. What was Caril Ann Fugate's true role in all of this? The debate started immediately. Some saw her as an accomplice, a cold-hearted participant who chose violence alongside Charles. Others saw a child, barely 14 years old, manipulated and controlled by an older, unstable boyfriend. The evidence pointed in both directions, maddeningly inconclusive. Charles, almost immediately, told authorities that Caril had been with him every step of the way, that she knew about everything, that she helped, that she never protested. Caril told a completely different story. Through tears, she insisted she had been a hostage from the very beginning, that Charles had threatened to harm her family, that she only learned her mother and siblings were gone after it was too late, that every moment of those 8 days had been spent in terror. But here's where it gets complicated. Investigators found inconsistencies in both versions. Witnesses reported seeing Caril acting normally at various stops, not like someone in distress. Gas station attendants remembered her buying food, chatting casually, showing no signs of being held against her will. Yet psychologists would later point out that trauma doesn't always look the way we expect, that a 14-year-old girl under extreme duress might cooperate with her captor as a survival mechanism. That fear can freeze you in place even when escape seems possible. One lesser-known detail emerged during early interrogations. When Charles was first captured, he had a superficial wound on his ear from a bullet that grazed him during the chase. He told officers that Caril had shot him, trying to stop him from continuing the violence. But then he changed his story multiple times, making it impossible to know what really happened in those final chaotic moments. The question burned in courtrooms, in newspapers, in living rooms across America. Was she guilty or innocent? Monster or victim? Partner or prisoner? If you're still following this case, wondering what really happened, take a moment to share your thoughts. Do you think Caril knowingly participated, or was she manipulated by someone older and more dangerous? Because even after all these years, there's no clear answer. And what came next, in the courtroom, would only make that question more urgent. Because 2 trials were about to begin. 2 different defendants, 2 very different defenses. And the American justice system would have to decide not just what happened, but who was responsible, and whether a 14-year-old girl could be held accountable for the darkest week in Nebraska history. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just entering a new, equally disturbing phase. Inside the interrogation rooms, two very different stories began to emerge. Charles Starkweather sat across from detectives with an unsettling calmness. He confessed to nearly everything, recounting details with a disturbing lack of emotion. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes his eyes gleamed with something that looked almost like pride, as if he'd finally achieved the notoriety he'd always craved. But when investigators asked about Caril, his story kept shifting. One moment he'd claim she was right there with him for everything, an active participant who never objected, who sometimes even encouraged him. The next moment he'd say he tried to protect her, that he kept her away from the worst of it, that she didn't really understand what was happening. Which version was true? Maybe neither. Maybe both. With Charles, the truth seemed to twist and change depending on his mood, his audience, his need for control even from behind bars. Caril's version never wavered. She sat in her own interrogation room, tears streaming down her 14-year-old face, insisting she had been terrified every single moment, that Charles had threatened to harm her if she tried to escape, that she didn't know her mother and stepfather were already gone until days later, that she had been trapped in a nightmare with no way out. She looked like a child, sounded like a victim, acted like someone who'd been psychologically shattered by trauma. But investigators weren't entirely convinced. Witness testimonies kept complicating her narrative. A gas station attendant in Nebraska remembered her coming inside alone, browsing candy bars, chatting about the weather. She seemed relaxed, normal, not like someone being held captive. Another witness recalled seeing Caril and Charles at a diner, sharing a meal, laughing at something. The witness thought they looked like any other young couple on a road trip. And then there were the opportunities. Multiple moments when Caril had been alone, when she could have whispered to a stranger, slipped away, flagged down help. Moments when Charles was distracted or out of sight. She never did. Why? The public split down the middle. Some saw a traumatized teenager, groomed and controlled by an older, violent boyfriend. They pointed to her age, to the power dynamics, to the psychological research showing how abuse victims often cooperate with their abusers as a survival mechanism. They believed her tears, her story, her insistence that she was a hostage. Others saw something darker, a manipulative girl trying to escape responsibility, someone who could have stopped it but chose not to. Someone who, at the very least, had been complicit through silence. The trials became a national obsession. Cameras weren't allowed in courtrooms back then, but newspapers sent armies of reporters. Sketch artists captured every expression, every gesture. The proceedings were dissected in evening broadcasts and morning headlines. Charles Starkweather's trial came first. His defense attempted to argue insanity, but the prosecution painted him as a cold, calculated individual who knew exactly what he was doing. The jury deliberated for just over 24 hours. Guilty on all counts. Sentence: death. Charles showed almost no reaction. He'd become the dangerous rebel he'd always wanted to be, and now he'd face the ultimate consequence. In a strange way, he seemed almost satisfied, as if infamy was its own kind of validation. Caril's trial was far more contentious. Her lawyers argued she was a victim, a child manipulated by someone older and violent. They brought in psychologists who explained coercive control, trauma bonding, the ways fear can paralyze rational thought. The prosecution countered with witness testimony, with the gas station stops, with the opportunities she never took. They argued that at some point, silence becomes complicity. The jury struggled. Days of deliberation, heated debates behind closed doors. Finally, they reached a verdict: guilty of first-degree involvement in one of the cases. Sentence: life imprisonment. Caril collapsed in the courtroom. Her sobs echoed off the walls as guards led her away. She was 15 years old by then, facing the possibility of spending the rest of her life behind bars. But here's a lesser-known detail that adds another layer to this story. During the trial, Charles actually testified against Caril. He took the stand and said she had been a willing participant, but legal experts later noted something odd in his testimony. His descriptions kept changing, contradicting himself, almost as if he was enjoying the power of controlling her fate one last time. Was he telling the truth? Or was this final act of manipulation, punishing her for not standing by him, for claiming she'd been his victim? Even the jury couldn't fully agree. Some members later admitted they had doubts, that the case against her felt incomplete, that her age should have mattered more. But the sentences stood. Charles on death row, Caril in prison for life. And across America, the case became something bigger than just a criminal investigation. It became a cultural moment, a symbol of teenage rebellion gone horrifically wrong, a mirror reflecting anxieties about youth, violence, media influence, and the fragility of innocence. Hollywood noticed. Within a few years, the story would inspire films, books, songs. The narrative of two young lovers on a violent spree across the heartland resonated in ways that made people deeply uncomfortable. Because maybe the scariest part wasn't that it happened, it was that everyone could almost understand how it happened. How loneliness and rage and desperation could twist two ordinary teenagers into something unrecognizable. And that proximity to understanding, that was terrifying. As the years passed, something strange happened to the story of Charles Starkweather and Caril Fugate. They stopped being just two people who committed terrible crimes. They became symbols, icons, a dark myth woven into the fabric of American culture. The image was too powerful to ignore. Two young lovers speeding down endless highways through the heartland, leaving destruction in their wake. It was horrifying, yes, but it was also cinematic. Romantic in the most twisted sense. A rebellion against society that went too far, crossed every line, and became unforgettable. Hollywood saw the potential immediately. In 1973, director Terrence Malick released Badlands, a film that transformed the case into something haunting and poetic. The movie didn't glorify the violence, but it captured something unsettling about the story. The ordinariness of the two young people, the flatness of the landscape, the quiet way horror can unfold in broad daylight. Martin Sheen played a character clearly inspired by Charles, with that same slicked-back hair, that same cold charisma. Sissy Spacek portrayed the teenage girl, wide-eyed and detached, floating through the nightmare as if watching it happen to someone else. The film became a classic, praised by critics, studied in film schools. It turned a real tragedy into art, and in doing so, it ensured the story would never fade away. Decades later, in 1994, Oliver Stone's Natural-Born Killers took the idea even further, exploring America's obsession with violence, with celebrity, with turning criminals into anti-heroes. Though not a direct adaptation, the DNA of Starkweather and Fugate's story pulsed through every frame. Musicians referenced them too. Bruce Springsteen's haunting song Nebraska was directly inspired by Charles Starkweather's flat, emotionless descriptions of what he'd done. The lyrics captured that same chilling emptiness. They declared me unfit to live, said into that great void my soul'd be hurled. The case had become larger than itself. It represented something America couldn't stop thinking about. The fear of youth without boundaries, without empathy, without the moral framework that supposedly holds civilization together. But while the legend grew, the real people at the center of it lived very different endings. Charles Starkweather was executed in the electric chair on June 25, 1959, just 17 months after his capture. He was 20 years old. In his final hours, he showed no remorse. He ate his last meal, a cold-cut platter that he barely touched. When asked if he had any final words, he reportedly said something dismissive about the world never understanding him anyway. At 11 minutes past midnight, 2,000 volts surged through his body. 3 minutes later, he was pronounced gone. The rebel who wanted to be noticed had finally disappeared into silence. Caril's story took a very different path. She spent nearly 18 years behind bars, becoming one of the youngest people in American history to receive a life sentence. Throughout her incarceration, she maintained the same story she'd told from the beginning, that she had been a hostage, that she never harmed anyone, that Charles had controlled her through fear. Prison changed her. She earned her high school diploma, She worked in the prison library. She became, by all accounts, a model inmate. In 1976, after years of appeals and public pressure, she was granted parole. She walked out of prison at 32 years old, having spent more than half her life locked away for crimes she insisted she didn't commit. Here's a lesser-known detail that haunted her for decades. When she was finally released, she tried to live quietly, to disappear into normalcy. She changed her name, moved to a small town in Michigan, worked as a medical assistant. But the story followed her everywhere. Co-workers would eventually recognize her. Neighbors would whisper. She could never fully escape the shadow of those 8 days in 1958. In 2007, nearly 50 years after the events, she applied for a pardon from the Nebraska Board of Pardons. She was in her 60s by then, gray-haired, soft-spoken, a grandmother trying to clear her name before she died. She testified for hours, describing in detail what she claimed really happened: the fear, the manipulation, the impossibility of escape when you're 14 and someone older controls every moment of your reality. The board denied her request. The doubt, it seemed, would follow her forever. Caril Fugate died in January 2025 at the age of 80, having lived most of her life insisting on a truth that many people never fully believed. Was she a victim? Was she complicit? The answer depends on who you ask. Some see a girl trapped by circumstance, by age, by a violent boyfriend who manipulated her into silence. Others see someone who had chances to stop it and chose not to. Maybe the truth lives somewhere in between, in that uncomfortable gray space where victimhood and responsibility blur together. What remains undeniable is this: 2 teenagers and 8 days in 1958 changed American culture forever. They forced uncomfortable questions about youth violence, about media influence, about how we decide who deserves sympathy and who deserves condemnation. The case became a mirror, reflecting our darkest fears about what young people might be capable of when the guardrails fail. And perhaps that's why, decades later, we still can't stop talking about it. Not because we have answers, but because the questions still terrify us. The story of Charles Starkweather and Caril Fugate continues to haunt us decades later, not because we don't know what happened, but because we can't agree on what it means. 11 lives lost in just 8 days. Families shattered beyond repair. Futures stolen in moments of senseless violence. But what truly marked this case, what made it burn itself into American consciousness, wasn't just the tragedy itself. It was the relationship at the center of it all. A young man consumed by rage, desperate to matter, willing to destroy anything that made him feel small. A teenage girl surrounded by suspicion, her truth forever questioned, her role forever debated. And between them, a question that refuses to fade. How much can one person influence another before individual responsibility disappears entirely? It's the question that keeps psychologists, lawyers, filmmakers, and ordinary people arguing even now, because the answer forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. We want clear villains, obvious monsters, people we can point to and say, that could never be me. But Charles wasn't born evil. He was bullied, ignored, humiliated. He built his rage one small wound at a time until it became something uncontrollable. And Caril, she was 14, an age when identity is still forming, when the need for acceptance can override almost everything else. Could she have truly understood what she was part of, or was she trapped in a psychological prison with no visible bars? Here's a detail that often gets overlooked. Years after her release, Caril gave an interview where she said the hardest part wasn't the years in prison. It was living with the knowledge that people would always wonder about her, always question whether she was telling the truth. She said it felt like serving a life sentence even after the prison doors opened, because the doubt followed her everywhere. That doubt is what makes this case so enduring, because it exposes something terrifying about violence. It doesn't always announce itself with clear warning signs. It doesn't always come from people who look dangerous or broken from the start. Sometimes it grows quietly in ordinary lives, fed by resentment, isolation, and toxic relationships, until one day it explodes in ways no one saw coming. That's what makes this story so unsettling. Not that it happened, but that it could happen. that two regular teenagers from regular families in regular towns could spiral into something so dark, so fast, that an entire nation would still be trying to understand it 70 years later. The case became a mirror, and what we see in it says as much about us as it does about them. Some see a cautionary tale about unchecked youth rebellion and moral decay. Others see a tragedy of manipulation and lost innocence. Both perspectives hold truth. Both miss something essential. Because maybe the real lesson is this: people are complicated. Guilt isn't always binary. Victimhood doesn't erase every choice. And sometimes the most honest answer to what really happened is simply, it's more complicated than we want it to be. The case lives on in films, songs, books, and endless debates because it touches something primal in us. The fear that the line between normal and monstrous is thinner than we'd like to believe. That given the wrong circumstances, the wrong influences, the wrong moment, any of us could veer into darkness. If you've stayed with this story all the way through, take a moment to reflect on what it stirs in you. What cases like this reveal about human nature, about justice, about the questions that never have clean answers. Share your thoughts. And if you know someone fascinated by the darker corners of true crime history, pass this along. Because as long as questions remain unanswered, as long as the truth stays fractured and contested, cases like this will never be forgotten. They linger in our collective memory not as closed chapters but as open wounds, reminding us that understanding evil is never as simple as we hope, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing about a story isn't what we know. It's what we'll never know for certain.